I suppose we should start with the mea culpa, shouldn't we? We'd start with the reasons why we didn't do more on it. And I think I know why. I read Private Eye religiously every fortnight. I'm a subscriber, so it drops through my letterbox in a plain white envelope. And few things bring me more of a frisson of anticipation than the arrival of what is, pound for pound, by far the finest journalistic outlet in this country. Also, it's largely free of comment journalism. It's basically jokes and revelations. Jokes, revelations, and Mickey takes. There's a little bit of comment in there, of course there is. But if you look at your average organ these days, I suppose with the exception of the Economist, it's wall-to-wall opinion. Slightly odd position for me to take, given that my job is basically offering you my opinions every morning and canvassing yours. But in terms of the sort of wider vista of media outlets, in the course of our lives, the segue, the shift from being largely news-led and news-driven, which is expensive, it's expensive to do news, to being opinion-led and opinion-driven, is quite spectacular. It's one of those things you don't really notice until you take a moment to step back from the fray and just consider how much things have changed. Younger people, looking at a young colleague now, will be unaware of the days when the news agenda was dominated by news rather than by opinions, rather than by arguments. Everywhere, from the BBC onwards, it essentially books people to have an argument these days. Entire television stations have been founded based upon putting forward one side of an argument and doing their level best to stifle the other. What would have been the mode or the format of the radio phone-in has now essentially, partly because it's cheap, has now essentially, in the context of newspapers and television, has become the sort of central platform of most media coverage. It's part of the reason why we spend so much of our lives at each other's throats, isn't it? And Private Eye manages to somehow rise above that fray, and it does extraordinary investigations. We've invited Private Eye journalists into the studio. Richard Brooks, whose work on the PPE contracts preceded much bigger coverage elsewhere. And I've always struggled, really, with the idea of why it doesn't have a louder voice, as it were, because it does hundreds of thousands of copies per issue. It's I think the most successful magazine in the country. It's certainly up there. And it does stories like the post office scandal, the postmaster, the sub-postmaster scandal, in incredible detail. And it does something that most media doesn't do. It stays with stuff for months or years. When the late, great Paul Foote was on the paper, was on Private Eye, they just refused to let go. Talk about a dog with a bone. That's the kind of journalism that I don't think, really, with a couple of glorious single-issue exceptions, it does the kind of journalism that doesn't really happen anymore. It used to be normal, Insight team at the Sunday Times, used to be normal to put journalists on a story for months without any guarantee that they'd get on the telly or get into the actual paper. Dull, grinding work sometimes in pursuit of detail, scandal and revelation. And so I remember reading about the post office scandal, and I think we had one go at doing it, but we didn't get the calls, so you can't go back to it. We're a little bit limited on this programme with what we can do. In retrospect, huge mistake. Reading these stories about people having their lives turned upside down because they were held responsible for errors made by a computer program, and the point at which so many people were being prosecuted and criminalised and jailed, and yet the post office's position was still that the individuals were to blame, that there was a sort of familial fraud. There was a culture of fraud among sub-postmasters that was robbing the country blind for decades. And the attitude the post office took to it, and their political masters took to it, was that it's not remotely anomalous, it's not remotely shocking, it's not remotely surprising that hundreds, if not, thousands of people have all been found to have been ripping the post office off for years, while they all insist to the prison gates. They insist that they have done nothing wrong and that it must be the the technology. More than 700 sub-postmasters were convicted between 1999 and 2015. An accounting system called Horizon made it seem as though money was missing from their businesses. Of those 700, only 93 convictions have been overturned. If it wasn't for a man called Alan Bates, one of the lead claimants and a representative of the Justice for Sub-Postmasters Alliance, it's possible that none of this would have seen the light of day, that the victims would still have their plight unregarded, unreported. Rishi Sunak has suggested exonerating all of the convicted parties. 60 or 70 of them, I have to tell you, have died so far. And you also have partners, husbands, wives who are ill or dying, as well as the individuals involved. It's been going on for years, he says, and it shouldn't be allowed. Now, the extraordinary thing about this, and I've offered up my own inadequate apology, the reason why we didn't do it more, despite the fact that I was reading Private Eye regularly, was that it doesn't work as a phone-in. If these people, particularly if they've been prosecuted or they are being prosecuted, are not allowed to talk to me. But why the story, and it was taken up, I mean, I think Radio 4 did something on it belatedly, but I don't have the capacity really to explain to you why something so huge, and you can tell how huge it is and you can tell how impactful it is by the response in the last week to the drama starring Toby Jones and Julie Hesmond-Helch and the accompanying documentary. I mean, it's actually almost unbelievable. And as Alan Bates says, it shouldn't be allowed. And it took the drama to exert the political pressure. Former Post Office Chief Executive called Paula Vanells remains a CBE, a commander of the British Empire. An enormous petition is in place to strip her of her title. The Justice Secretary is now looking at the things that were described to the Prime Minister on the telly yesterday. And he added, the Prime Minister added, it's right that we find every which way we can to try and make this right for the people who were so wrongfully treated at the time. He also said something about it all happened in the 1990s when, as anybody who's been paying the vaguest bit of attention would know, that this was actually happening right up until 2015. The convictions themselves didn't start until 1999. So Sunak once again demonstrating that he's just not very good at politics. One former postmaster, speaking yesterday to the BBC, described being pursued through the courts, paying hundreds of thousands of pounds, and then went bankrupt. The victims, he said, are traumatised. It's been a long time, 25 years, £135 million has been paid to some of the victims, but we've had £150 million plus paid to lawyers. And this is the point, I think, that perhaps lies at the heart of the problem. We are just normal, run-of-the-mill people. We have legal people with us, but it is so difficult, and it is like a war. Those are the words of Lee Castleton, former postmaster, victim of the scandal. While most of your newspapers were busy shouting about refugees or Brussels or, I don't know, single mothers or unemployed people, sub-postmasters up and down the country were being criminalised in quite extraordinarily awful ways. The Great Post Office trial on Radio 4 touched on this, but didn't get anything like the movement that this ITV drama has received. And as I say, Private Eye has been banging this drum with incredible accuracy and indefatigability for pretty much the entire period of time under discussion. So you now know the facts, whether you've watched the drama or not, whether you're across all of the details or not, doesn't really matter. You have a scandal affecting hundreds of people, a dodgy accounting system made by Fujitsu was responsible for creating the illusion that hundreds of sub-postmasters had been stealing money from the post office. And while they all screamed their innocence to the prison gates, they were all ignored. You live in this country. You were living in this country when this happened. You are living in this country as this unfolds. Just take a moment this morning to explain to me why you think. There's also a journalist called Nick Wallace who I think we have spoken to on the programme, who has been pursuing this with extraordinary rigour and vigour. But until it became an ITV drama, the needle barely moved. And that's what I want you to talk to me about. Because, I mean, I do this for a living. I talk about stuff in the news. I make decisions every day on what's likely to engage you and what matters. I can't quite get my head around the fact that it took a drama. It took a dramatisation of a fairly well-reported scandal, albeit not reported with the same vigour that some news outlets report, I don't know, parking tickets, e-bikes and whatever the flavour of the day story is to wind you up. It was fairly well reported in grown-up media, and yet it has barely impacted at all more broadly until ITV made a drama about it. And that's all I'm going to ask you. And I want you to tell me why. How did this happen in your view? You don't have to be remotely connected to the story. You just need to understand what television is and what a false conviction is. How? How did this happen? And obviously, if you've got skin in the game, if you or someone you care for or know was caught up in this horrible, horrible story, a word on what it was actually like would be fascinating, would be worth its weight in gold. I would very much welcome that. 0345 6060 973 is the number that you need. Remember, Rishi Sunak, as someone's just pointed out in a text that I don't think is signed, Rishi Sunak was jumping up and down to get involved in Nigel Farage's banking arrangements. But on this, he said absolutely nothing until ITV turned it into a drama. Just use that as a way into it, if you would. The Prime Minister of the United Kingdom is more concerned about the personal banking arrangements of the most stubborn skid mark on the underpants of British politics than he is about 700 honest tax-paying workers being criminalised, prosecuted and traumatised for crimes they did not commit. And he doesn't get his finger out until it becomes a drama on ITV. So there are questions for the media to answer. But the Tories have been in power since 2010. The convictions and the unfolding scandal has been unfolding for the duration of that period. What was it like to be involved? And crucially, how do you explain this to yourself, never mind to me? How do you account for the fact that until it was a drama on ITV in the week after Christmas, nobody really cared?